Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I know it has been quite a while since I posted any book-related content here on YouTube, so I wanted to kick off this new reading year by talking about every book that I read in 2023, and I'm going to be ranking them from the worst to the best. Keep in mind, I'm only going to be ranking books that I read from cover to cover. I won't be including any DNFs on this list, as I like to give every book its fair shot by reading it from cover to cover. Also, keep in mind that many of the books on this list are going to be books that I have yet to do standalone reviews for. So if you are wanting my more in-depth thoughts on some of these titles, let me know down in the comment section below, and I would be more than happy to make standalone reviews for any highly requested books. With that said, let's get into the list. Coming in at last place at number 15 is going to be The Warden and the Wolf King by Andrew Peterson. Unfortunately, this was my biggest disappointment of 2023, as I enjoyed all of the Wingfeather Saga books leading up to this final entry. Unfortunately for me, while this book is very heavily praised, it rang pretty emotionally hollow for me. And the reason for that is without spoiling anything, this book does so many things that I personally find annoying in fantasy books. The biggest ones being that there are so many fake-out deaths in this book, which was already a complaint that I had about book 3. But here, it's just cranked up to 11. And when you have all of these fake-out deaths, it makes it very hard for me as the reader to emotionally resonate with what's going on, because I'm convinced that half of these characters are going to live anyway. This is also the longest of the Wingfeather Saga books, and to be honest, I don't think it really justifies its length. There are a lot of scenes of the characters traveling, which we had gotten in previous entries in the series, but in your final book, in your grand epic conclusion to this story, why are we spending so much time on the characters moving from point A to point B? And when characters actually do start to get killed off, I think it was handled very poorly, unfortunately. A lot of it just didn't ring true to what the author was going for, and we just spent a lot of time with the characters in locations and areas that didn't feel relevant to the overarching story. But to me, this book's biggest sin is the fact that it has a poignant emotional resolution, and then it keeps going. And then it completely undercuts it with the way that the narrative wraps up. And it just felt like such a cop-out for what otherwise would have been a really strong conclusion. I get that this is a children's book, and so you don't want to go too dark. But man, just undoing the way the book concluded just really undercut the emotional resonance of it for me. This book is not without its positives. The characters are still solid. The witty banter that you come to get used to in the series is still there. But overall, I just found this to be a very disappointing conclusion to what was otherwise a pretty strong series. Coming in at 14 is Cytonic by Brandon Sanderson, which is the third book in the Skyward series, and unfortunately, this is by far the weakest entry in that series. Of all the books so far in the Skyward series, this one suffers the most from middle book syndrome. The events of this particular novel feel so disconnected from the overarching conflict of the rest of the series. This book feels more like a side story for Spenza rather than a continuation of her progression as a character throughout the series. It seems like Sanderson largely wrote this book in order to give big lore dumps for the universe, to set up stuff that I assume will be paid off in book 4. But the way those exposition dumps are interspersed through the narrative is so clumsy to me, which is very surprising because normally Sanderson does a pretty good job of sprinkling exposition through his stories while still keeping the narrative flowing at a generally good pace. But here, All of the exposition just kind of hits you like a freight train, and I honestly forget a lot of the major reveals that happened in this book because there is just so much given to you here. I do wonder if Skyward would have worked better as a trilogy, and instead of having this middle third book that feels kind of awkwardly placed because it's mostly just setting up stakes for the fourth book rather than having a lot of stakes in and of itself. This book also just introduced more characters that I didn't really care about as the reader. In the first Skyward book, I got really attached to that original cast of characters, that original group, and I wanted to see them go on adventures together. And it was acceptable to separate Spenza from the group in Starsight, because there, the exposition tied a lot more clearly into the overarching narrative. But in book 3, we distance ourselves from the characters set up in book 2 to introduce even more characters. And so now I'm even more emotionally disconnected from what's going on. And the pacing of this book was pretty weak as well. I think this one is the shortest of the mainline Skyward series books, but it just was not paced out very well. The beginning was kind of interesting because you're in this new world and getting all these concepts explained to you, but man, there just was not a lot of forward momentum to this particular book. And overall, unfortunately, I would have to say this is probably my least favorite Brandon Sanderson book that I've read thus far. On the positive side, I would still say that Sanderson's humor is pretty strong overall. The characters are still good. Their actions within the narrative make sense. It's just the journey of getting there that's really weak. This book did not make me as angry or as frustrated as The Warden and the Wolf King did, hence why it is not at the very bottom of the list, but it's also not good enough for me to justify putting it any higher up on this list. Coming in at number 13 is going to be Old Man's War by John Scalzi, and at this point in the list we move from books that I found disappointing or bad to books that were just okay and didn't really move the needle one way or the other for me. And for me, Old Man's War was still a little disappointing because this book was hyped up to me a lot. It is one of the quintessential modern military science fiction books, but to me it was just kind of okay. I think what prevented me from getting really invested was that I did not like the romance in this book, for one thing. It starts off really good with this main character mourning his dead wife, but then without spoiling anything, the love interest that is introduced later in the plot, it raises a lot of concerning ethical implications that the book doesn't really take the time to get into. Maybe this is just a personal problem, but I found it a lot more kind of creepy than loving and romantic. Also, John Scalzi's humor was very hit or miss for me. Sometimes it was pretty funny. Sometimes there were lines that did make me laugh out loud, and other times it felt like it was trying too hard. It was trying too hard to be witty, trying too hard to tickle your funny bone, and so it just came across as just kind of flat and uninteresting. Overall, I can see why this is a book that a lot of people really like, as the world building is decent, there are some funny jokes, and the characters aren't bad. It's just one that I didn't really get sucked into. Coming in at number 12 is going to be All Systems Red by Martha Wells, which is the first book in the Murderbot Diaries. And this is one of those series, like Old Man's War, this is one of those series that has been hyped so much. These novellas are incredibly popular right now, and unfortunately for me, this is another book that I just thought was okay. Easily the strongest aspect of this book is our POV character, Murderbot. The whole premise of the book revolves around this assassination, murderous robot gaining sentience and becoming self-aware, and him having to wrestle with the implications of he has been programmed to murder, as the name implies, but he kind of is wondering, maybe I could do something else with my life besides kill people. And that whole dynamic dynamic is definitely what elevates this book, and there's a lot of great humor, a lot of really good morbid humor that comes from our main character. And so I understand why people really gravitate to this series. But what really held this book back for me is that while Murderbot himself is a very interesting and fun character to follow, everything else around him is pretty bland and generic. The side characters, I couldn't name them for you, and the plot, I honestly struggle to remember as I am making this video because that is not what the focus of the narrative is on. The focus is on Murderbot and his development as a character. And if that's enough to carry you through a story, then you'll probably love this. But for me, I was just hoping for a little more meat on the bone in terms of the side characters and the overarching narrative in order for me to get really invested. It's a series that I may come back to at a certain point, but overall I thought Murderbot was just okay. Coming in at number 11 is going to be Soulsmith by Will White, which is the second book in the Cradle series, and overall I thought this was a pretty standard sequel to Unsouled. Unfortunately, this book did not surpass or even meet the level of the original for me. It was just kind of, once again, okay. The reason for this being is that this book very much feels like a setup book. The stakes of this book in and of itself feel very disconnected once again from the overarching narrative of the Cradle series. And unfortunately, that's what I'm most invested in Cradle, is Lyndon and Yaren and this overarching threat to the world that they are trying to address. But in Soulsmith, in book 2, most of the time is spent with the main characters chasing after this MacGuffin that bears no real significance to that overarching threat, end of the world stakes. And so it's hard for me to get invested in this story because the stakes feel so removed from the much grander stakes that the series is going for. However, why this book is above the others that I've listed so far is the characters here are particularly strong. Lyndon and Yaren are both great main characters to follow. You very much sympathize with Lyndon like you did in book 1 in terms of his struggle of trying to become this master warrior to save the world. We get a lot more backstory on Yaren and where she comes from and why she's a much more hard-edged character than our main character. And then finally, what saved this book for me, frankly, was Ethan. This is one of those characters that I am really excited to continue following with the books that follow because he is so funny, he is so witty, and his backstory, once it's revealed, just makes him such an interesting and hilarious character at the same time. And the fight scenes that he's involved in are always the most entertaining part of this book. And so while the plot of this particular entry may not have hooked me, what it sets up in terms of the characters and their goals for book 3 and moving forward did keep me invested, and I am excited to get into Black Flame, which is book 3 in the Cradle series. Bringing us into the top 10 is going to be probably a controversial pick, and that's going to be Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Now, I want to say right off the get-go that this book's influence on science fiction in general is so tremendous. This book basically established the cyberpunk subgenre, and the films that followed from this book, Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, have both been incredibly influential in their own rights, and so all the credit needs to go to Philip K. Dick for what he did in this novel conceptually. However, for me, my hot take is that I think that the Blade Runner films do a better job of exploring the themes that Philip K. Dick was going for than he does in his novel. And the reason for this is because in this book, the characters are very emotionally distant from the reader. And while I acknowledge that some of that is intentional, it makes it hard for me to get emotionally invested in what's going on. Secondly, while the world setup in this book is very interesting and very good, hence why it's above the other books that I've listed so far, the way this book handles its themes is very messy. It really feels like Philip K. Dick wanted to explore a lot of different themes with this novel, but given the length and the scope of it, it just comes across as very cluttered. And that's why I think the Blade Runner films do a better job as cyberpunk stories, because each of them, both Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, kind of pick one central theme and explore it to the nth degree, which I think is a much smarter way to handle a story like this, whereas in the original book, it feels very scattershot. We get some stuff about what does it mean to be human. We get some stuff about corporate greed. We get some stuff about our main character's terrible marriage life. We get some stuff about religion and what are the theological implications of building androids that resemble humans, but none of it quite coheres for me. And so that's why this book is one that, while I respect it and I appreciate it, it's not one that I will probably return to very often. Coming in at number 9 is going to be Starsight by Brandon Sanderson, which is the second book in the Skyward series, and to me, there is a league of quality between Starsight and Cytonic. Starsight is a pretty solid follow-up to that first book, Skyward. You get a lot more depth to the characters. You get a lot more expansion of the universe, and the stakes are very clearly conveyed. And unlike Cytonic, the exposition here is delivered very solidly. It is sprinkled throughout the narrative, and it is connected to characters that Spenza meets in the story. So when these characters are explaining the lore, you are still emotionally invested because you care about the characters who are explaining these things about these different alien cultures that they come from. Also, while the second squad that Spenza is paired up with in this story is still not as interesting as the original Skyward flight, they are still pretty interesting in their own right. The standout being Hesho, because it is just such a fun concept to have this little hamster-like creature who has a samurai's code of honor. It just makes for some really good comedy that Sanderson is known for, and it is very strong in this story. What holds this book back for me for being as good as the first one is the training montages in this book are long and tedious and very repetitive. I feel like you could have gotten away with 1 or 2 training sequences in the story, but we have like 3 or 4. And so it just really bloats the narrative in a way that I think is unjustified for the kind of story that's being told. But what saves this book is that its final climactic battle is very good and is on par with that first book. And on top of this, we get some new antagonists introduced in Starsight that are, and I would argue, even better than the ones that book 1 had established. And so you have these new interesting villains that will then appear in later entries, which is part of the reason why Cytonic falls flat, is because those villains do not appear in Book 3. And I was really interested in seeing where these antagonists would end up in terms of the narrative. But enough about Cytonic. I'm judging this book on its own, and overall, I would say that Starsight, while a little weaker than Skyward, is still a very solid entry in the series. At number 8 is going to be Fractal Noise by Christopher Paolini, which is his second book in the Fractalverse series, though this one is technically a prequel to the first book, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. And this one was a big surprise for me, because To Sleep in a Sea of Stars was a book that I thought was just okay. I thought it had decent characters, decent world building, but really suffered from poor pacing. And Fractal Noise surprised me because, to be honest, I think it improved upon every single criticism that I had of Paolini's first book. Here, the narrative is a lot tighter. The pacing is a lot better because our characters are working towards a clear, set goal. And so it has a lot more forward momentum than the first Fractalverse book did. And this book is comprised almost entirely of character interactions and character discussions, which for some readers might be a turnoff. Some readers prefer more plot-driven stories, but for me, I really liked the discussions between these characters that came about because of what they were doing. The basic premise of this book is that these three characters are going on a mission together towards this alien monument that they aren't quite sure what it is, what its purpose is, or even how long it will take them to get there. And everything that happens throughout the journey continues to drive home this impending doom. And it is so well conveyed in this story. Paolini said that the basis for this book was a nightmare that he had about three characters heading towards this big pit that this resonating, booming noise was coming out of. And I'll tell you what, listening to this book on audio, I think made it even that much more impactful for me, because you get those rhythmic booms throughout the whole course of the narrative, and it does a great job of establishing the tension building within this group of characters. And overall, I found the characters to be really interesting, and I loved that they were having all these discussions about theology and philosophy of, if this is indeed first contact with aliens, what does that mean for religion and philosophy and our view of the world and our view of humanity? And all of those discussions were very well done. The only reason I gave this book 4 stars instead of 5 is because the obstacles that the characters encounter throughout the book get a little bit repetitive. I can't tell you the number of times in this book where a character slips and falls, and that is what is delaying our characters from getting to this big alien monument. And I get that that's probably realistic to the kind of things that you would encounter, but I was kind of hoping for a little more variation in terms of the different obstacles that our characters would run into. But overall, this was a really solid read, and it gets me really excited to see what Paolini does with the Fractalverse in the future. Coming in at number 7 is going to be 9 Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny, which is the first book in the Chronicles of Amber series, and this was my biggest surprise of last year, because I knew nothing about the Chronicles of Amber going into it, other than that it is fantasy. And I'm so glad that I went into this series blind, because the premise of this book does such a great job of putting you in the headspace of the main character, where you, like the main character, don't know what the heck is going on, and you are piecing together all these bits of the universe and the world as the story progresses. Definitely this book's strongest point is that it is fast-paced. It is probably the fastest-paced book that I read last year. It keeps you hooked the whole time, to the point I read this whole book over the course of a weekend because it just sucked me in that easily. And I think Roger Zelazny does a great job in this book of merging fantasy and science fiction, and I can see how this series was very innovative for its day, because you didn't see a whole lot of other books merging science fiction and fantasy in the way that Roger Zelazny did. This book also dabbles heavily with the concept of the multiverse, which, while in modern fiction is kind of being done to death, back when this was originally written, that would have been very innovative. And I think Roger Zelazny does a lot with that concept to make it interesting. And I think another thing that really carried this book for me was that the character banter is really strong. I think Zelazny is very underrated when it comes to his humor and his dialogue. The dialogue is so snappy. It feels very modern. And that's what gives 9 Princes in Amber such a unique tone, because it is set in a traditional fantasy world, but it also includes some elements of sci-fi and has very modern dialogue. And somehow all of that comes together to make a really fun, fast-paced, engaging narrative. The only thing that held this book back for me is I thought that while the pacing was really good, I thought we could have used some more descriptions about certain locations, about certain battles that take place. My biggest annoyance from this book was that there was a battle that took place entirely off page. We only hear about it as the reader and get like one paragraph of description of what actually happened. I think if the descriptions had been more filled out, this would have been an easy 5-star for me. But because those descriptions were left a little lacking, it brings the book down slightly for me. But overall, I am excited to continue the Chronicles of Amber series because this was a really solid first entry that completely caught me off guard. Coming in at number 6 is going to be Unsold by Will White, which is the first book in the Cradle series. I got this entire series for free on Kindle, and honestly, this was so much better than I was expecting it to be. Unfortunately, self-publishing often gets a bad reputation because unfortunately a lot of self-published books do not have the same kind of polish and care put into them as traditionally published books. But I think that books like Unsold show that that is a mischaracterization, because this was just as solid as any traditionally published book that I've read before. And what makes Unsold so unique is that Will White very clearly takes a lot of inspiration from anime and Asian media in general, and even though this is not a visual medium, that influence very much comes across in the storytelling and the narrative structure. Cradle basically feels like a really good shonen anime adapted into a novel form. And I know that shonen anime is not everyone's cup of tea, but for me, this really worked. To me, this is a narrative that would fit right in with stuff like One Piece, Dragon Ball Z, and all these other very famous shonen anime stories. This book also has a very unique magic system because it is a lit RPG, which basically means that it is a progression-based magic system, similar to like a role-playing game like Final Fantasy or Persona. And I thought it really worked. I've never read a lit RPG before, but I thought it was done very creatively and in a way that got you hooked of like, okay, I'm ready to see my main character get stronger. I'm ready to see him take on even bigger and bigger threats over the course of the narrative. And this book is very much helped by the fact that Lyndon is a very sympathetic main character. He is someone that you are rooting for because of his wholesome values and because of his strong moral compass and because he's an underdog that is underestimated by everyone, and so you really want to see him succeed. My only downside to this book is that while Acts 1 and 2 of this book were really solid and really engaging, the third act kind of faltered a bit for me. The third act of this book felt more like a setup for Soulsmith, the next book, rather than a natural culmination of events that were established in the beginning of the book. And as such, the third act kind of felt disconnected from the rest of the novel. But otherwise, this was a really solid book, and probably one of my favorite self-published books that I've read thus far. And even though Soulsmith was a bit weaker than Unsold, I'm still eager to continue the Cradle series because of how strong Book 1 is. Before I get into my top 5 books of last year, if you like this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button and comment down below on what was your personal favorite read from last year, as well as what are some books you would like to see me review on this channel in the future. And with that, let's get into my top 5 favorite reads from last year, starting with, at number 5, Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This was the first of Sanderson's secret projects, which he released over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is such a solid book. This has everything that I could possibly want from a fantasy story. Very solid pacing, great narrative structure, fun and engaging characters, and it manages to balance having this very silly tone with also still having stakes and still having an overarching plot that you are invested in and are taking seriously, even if the characters in the story have all of this goofy dialogue. Brandon Sanderson said that this book was inspired by watching the Princess Bride movie, and you very much get that sense when you read this book. To me, this book very much captures the spirit of what made The Princess Bride such a classic movie, but it never feels like a ripoff. It never feels like Sanderson is just copying beat for beat what the movie did, but in a different setting. No, he takes the tone and the basic premise of The Princess Bride, but then he puts his own spin on it. And it really works. It really comes together here. And this was the first book in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere that I've read. And I thought this was a really solid introduction. I know a lot of people would argue that you should start with stuff like Mistborn or Stormlight Archive. But for me, if you're just a casual reader who is not familiar with Sanderson in the slightest, this is not a bad place to start because it's a spin-off and is largely disconnected from the overarching events of the Cosmere, but it feels like a very cozy read that anyone could easily get into. And with Tress of the Emerald Sea, this is one of those books I could easily recommend to any person who likes fantasy. And even for people who don't like fantasy, I think this is not a bad place to start. Coming in at number 4 is the only book that made me cry last year, and that is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. This was the third of Brandon Sanderson's secret projects, and I was debating very heavily between Tress and Yumi as to which one was better, because they both are very strong in different ways. But ultimately, I gotta give the edge to Yumi because it is the one where I was the most emotionally invested in the plot and in the characters' fate. Sanderson has vocally said that this book takes heavy inspiration from the video game Final Fantasy X, which is one of my favorites from that series. And once again, just like with Tress of the Emerald Sea, Brandon Sanderson always does a great job of taking the basic premise of a pre-existing story, but putting his own spin on it so it doesn't feel like he's just ripping off something or doing a beat-for-beat remake of the story that he's taking inspiration from. I think one of Yumi's strongest points is the world building is so interesting because you have these two characters, one coming from a more fantasy world based on Korean culture, and one coming from a more sci-fi world based on Japanese culture. And the way the two stories and the way the two worlds intersect is so engaging and gripping and very unique for Sanderson's writing repertoire. Sanderson also said he took a lot of inspiration from Korean dramas when writing this book, and while I haven't watched any K-dramas personally, I could very easily see someone who gets invested in that kind of medium getting really sucked into Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And it's funny because this book had me a little worried at first because Sanderson is not known for his romance. And this book is first and foremost a love story, which is not a genre that I typically gravitate towards. But here, I was so invested that I cried. And if someone who does not usually get invested in love stories can get that invested, I think that shows just how good this book is at getting you attached to the characters. They have great banter, great chemistry, and each of them have their own emotional journeys that they go through that just sucks you in from beginning to end. And so while Tress and Yumi are kind of neck and neck, I've got to give the edge to Yumi because of the emotional weight that is put on the narrative. Bringing us into the top 3 is going to be The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, and this book is just classic science fiction at its finest. I was already a big fan of Ray Bradbury because of Fahrenheit 451, which is one of my favorite books of all time, and The Martian Chronicles easily stands toe to toe with that book. What makes The Martian Chronicles so fascinating is that it tackles so many different themes. But unlike the original Blade Runner novel, this book never loses its focus. And one of the things that really helps this book is the fact that it is an anthology story. You are never following one character all the way to the conclusion of the narrative. Instead, the way this book is set up is that you are following the human colonization of Mars as it happens over the course of all these decades and seeing all of the benefits as well as the problems that arise because of humanity landing on this new planet. And what makes this book so fascinating is that Ray Bradbury is able to use that framing device to explore so many different themes, from colonization to racism to classism to bringing all the problems that we had on Earth and bringing it to a new frontier. And it is just such a great way to explore those themes without it ever feeling very heavy-handed. The planetary colonization storyline is something that's been done to death in media nowadays. But this book still manages to feel fresh in the way that it explores all of the different things that happen because of humanity coming to Mars. I have to confess that one of the reasons I gravitated to this book so much is because I'm fascinated by space colonization, and I am fascinated by the possibility that we could be landing men on Mars for the first time here in just the next few years, and I really want to see what comes of that. And so it's really cool to read books like this, knowing that we are very, very close to reaching the points that these authors were describing all the way back in the 1950s. The Martian Chronicles is one of those sci-fi novels that I don't see talked about very often, but to me, this one is such a classic for the way it expertly explores all of these different themes without ever losing touch of what its core driving narrative is. Coming in at number 2, the runner-up for the best book of 2023 for me is The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. As many of you have probably already seen, the Forever War book review is still the most viewed video on my channel, which I am incredibly proud of because this is a book that deeply resonates with me. It is military science fiction at its finest, to the point where I consider Starship Troopers and The Forever War to be on par with one another. And what makes The Forever War so interesting is that while Starship Troopers takes a very glorified approach to war and human expansionism, The Forever War takes a very negative approach. But it gives a negative approach without ever tarnishing the legacy of soldiers, without ever just being anti-military for the sake of being anti-military. No, this book explores the cost of war from a number of different angles. You have the stories of the troops on the ground fighting the aliens and the horrific things that happen to them because of this war, but then you also get to see how the war is affecting society on Earth, and you get to learn over the course of the narrative how humanity doesn't even know why it's fighting this war to begin with. And you get to see also some very heavy themes about how veterans often become disconnected from the rest of society because society's experience does not line up with what these veterans have experienced on the war front. And so it creates this very interesting dynamic that you don't see explored a lot in media. Unfortunately, a lot of media nowadays tends to go at it from one of two angles. Either military is all good, patriotism, hoorah sort of vibe, or military is bad, bad guys want to crush everything in their path. And the beauty about the Forever War is that it has a much more nuanced take on the military than we typically get in media nowadays. And it definitely feels like a story that was written by someone with personal experience, with personal involvement in the military and in America's foreign wars. I also had the great opportunity to interview Joe Haldeman and Gay Haldeman on this channel, and it was so cool to talk with him and to learn more about what inspired him to write this story. And there's a reason that this story is a classic, because the themes of the Forever War feel even more relevant now, given where the world is at nowadays, where you have all of these different conflicts with no end in sight and with objectives that are becoming increasingly muddled because of the political situation going on behind the scenes. And so not only would I argue that this is a very excellent science fiction book, this is a very important book that people should read if they want to get an idea of what our future could look like if things keep going the way they are going. And so overall, that is why The Forever War is such a fantastic book and why it's my runner-up for my favorite book of last year. And while it was very close between The Forever War and my number one, I ultimately have to give it number one. My favorite book of 2023 was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And again, this is basically where I'm just at this point comparing enjoyment to importance. And at the end of the day, there is no denying that Frankenstein is one of the most important fiction books ever written. Full stop. Not even in just the realm of sci-fi, but just in literature in general. And what makes Frankenstein so good is that it has been described as the modern Prometheus story. It is man extending his desires beyond where their limits should be. It is man trying to play God. And for me, Frankenstein is the best story that has ever explored those kinds of themes. The book is so rich with allusions to philosophy, with its religious implications, and with your investment in the characters. It's so interesting to read this book knowing what the pop culture version of Frankenstein is, and then to go back to the book and see all of the ways in which, frankly, pop culture has gotten it wrong. You know, typically the pop culture versions of Frankenstein have very much focused on the monster as this evil, threatening force. They take more of a horror route to the story. But I would argue that Frankenstein is much more of a philosophical and religious book than it is a horror story. The horror element of Frankenstein is just one piece of the puzzle. The whole book is dedicated to this theme of man trying to play God and exceeding the limits that he should have. And it does so expertly. I also have to say that the prose in Frankenstein, it reads like poetry. There are so many lines of dialogue and statements made by the characters that feel like they could be in a stage play, that feel like they could be Shakespeare. They are so well written. And it is mind-blowing to think that Mary Shelley wrote this book when I think she was 19. She was very young when she wrote this book. And it is an all-time classic for a reason. And so for all of those reasons, I have to give Frankenstein my number one pick as my favorite book that I read in 2023. I hope you all have enjoyed this ranking, and I look forward to putting out more book reviews this year. I am wrapping up my semester of school very soon, so expect to see a lot more quantity and hopefully better quality of videos in the near future. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.